Hey guys, this is George with Firehouse Music, and today we're going to continue talking about our fundamental musical concepts. We're going to take the concept that we talked about last week and go a little bit further. We talked about the major scale and how the different notes work and everything else. If you haven't watched that video, go back to it because it's important so you can understand what we're going to talk about today, which is intervals. Now, intervals, it's a very humble concept, but it's paramount that you understand it before we start talking about other musical structures like triads and bigger chords and even other scales. And your understanding of the major scale, again, it's a prerequisite for you to understand how intervals work, because otherwise they just become a chart that you have to memorize. Okay, so let's start from the major scale. So we're going to look at intervals, right? That's our topic of the day, intervals. And if you remember last week's lesson, we had our C major scale. So we have C, D, E, F, G, A, B, and C. Okay? Now, we gave each one of these notes a number, right? So we have two C's, so we don't number them twice. This is 1, and this one is also 1. All right? And we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. And I told you these numbers were going to be important, and it's precisely because of intervals. Okay? So intervals, by definition, is just the distance between two notes. That's it. That's what an interval is. Okay? Now, the different types of intervals, that's where all this stuff comes in. The distance between the first note and the second note is called a second. The distance between the first note and the third note is called a third. From the first to the fourth, it's called a fourth. From the first to the fifth, it's called a fifth. From the first to the sixth, it's called a sixth. From the first to the seventh, it's called a seventh. And then when you go from the first note to the last note, that's called an octave. When you have the same note, but they're in a different register, meaning, let me pick up the guitar. Turn off the amp this time. So what I mean by that is if we have the same note, I hope this thing is in tune. I haven't touched this since yesterday. A little bit out of tune there. That's better. Okay. So when you have the same note, right? So you have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 1. Notice that these two notes, right? They're the same note. They're both C's in this case, right? But they sound different. One is higher than the other. So when you get from C to C, that's an octave, okay? And then from C to D, that's a second. From C to E, that's a third. From C to F, that's a fourth. C to G, it's a fifth. C to A, it's a sixth. C to B, seventh. C to C, octave. Okay? So those are the intervals. Let me put these down for a second. This will be a very short video. If this was all there was to intervals, this will be a very short video. But where people get confused is on the different types of intervals, right? In the major scale, let me erase this so you guys understand now what all this stuff is. In the major scale, if we are measuring from the first note, okay, if we're measuring from any one of the other notes, we'll talk about that in a minute. Because if you go from 2 to 3, that's still a second. If you go from 2 to 4, that's a third. 2 to 5, it's a fourth, and so on. Same thing, no matter where you're going, because we're measuring distance, right? So if I have this, and I move it over here, it's always a third, right? 4 to 6 is a third. 5 to 7 is a third. 6 to 1 is a third. Okay, and the same thing is true of all the bigger intervals as well. But the type changes. So now, if we're talking about measuring from the first note only, right, our intervals are either perfect or they are major. And that's a very easy thing to remember because we're talking about the major scale. So the major scale, everything in the major scale, right, if we're measuring from the first note, those intervals are either going to be major or they're going to be perfect. I'm not going to get into why they're called perfect and major and minor, because that's involves physics and acoustics and stuff. It falls outside the scope of this video. It will take way too long. There's a Wikipedia article you can check out if you want to find out more about that. But anyway, so we have this. Now, which ones are perfect and which ones are major, right? Our fourth, 1 to 4, our fifth, 1 to 5, and our octave, 1 to 1. Those are our perfect intervals. So fourth, fifth, and our octave are going to be our perfect intervals. Everything else is major, okay? So once again, the fourth, the fifth, and the octave are perfect. Everything else is major. That means that my second is a major second. My third is a major third. My fourth is a perfect fifth. My fifth is a perfect fifth. My sixth is a major sixth. My seventh is a major seventh. And then my octave is a perfect octave. Okay? So, we're talking about, this right now. So, since I'm designating these intervals with these names, there has to be something else. And there is. One thing I missed when we were talking about intervals earlier is that you can articulate an interval in two different ways. And you don't need the scale anymore. We're just going to look at a simple interval. Let's look at the fifth. Okay? So if we have the fifth, so C to G. Okay? If I play it one note at a time, that's called a melodic interval. In this case, a melodic perfect fifth. If I play them at the same time, like this, right? So if you remember the video about rhythm, right? When we were talking about the time, notice that these two events are happening at the same time. They're stacked on top of each other, right? So this happens first, then this, and now they're happening at the same time. When you're articulating an interval in this manner, you have what is called a harmonic interval. In this case, a harmonic perfect fifth. And that's just nomenclature, it's terminology. It's not that important, in my opinion, unless you're communicating among academics. But it's good to know, just in case you ever find yourself talking to a music theory professor or something like that. It's good to know these things. Or if you are going to school and you're trying to remember these concepts, then you have to, because these kinds of things go in tests. We're not testing here. So we have this, right? So that's the other thing. So now let's talk about, so what's the difference between a major interval and a minor interval, and a perfect interval and a diminished or augmented interval? Size. Let's look at this thing abstractly first, because I think it's easier to understand that way. And then we'll play them on the guitar, and then I'll show you on the staff. Okay? If you have a distance, right? Say this is 1 point, and this is another point, and this is my interval right here. I can make this interval bigger or smaller by moving one of my points. So I can take what most people think is they keep the bottom point constant, and then they move the top point back, right? And okay, now it's smaller. But you can also, make sure it's the same size, you can also move the bottom point up, okay? And now it's smaller. Now, a major interval. If you, and now we got to talk about semitones. So let me show you on the guitar, so it makes more sense. So what I just did there with the lines, I can do that on the guitar. And the guitar is a great instrument to understand this because everything is linear, it's kind of stacked in one place. So a fifth is kind of impractical to play on a single string because it's really far away. But I can play it down here, the same note, C to G, right? That's, by the way, that's a power chord. You use that in rock a lot. Anyway, so C to G. And then 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 I can make that interval bigger by moving my fret up higher. And now I have what's called an augmented fifth. Okay? I can also take my top note and move it down. And I have what's called a diminished fifth. So augmented and diminished are terms that define the interval as a little bit bigger or a little bit smaller. So what's a little bit? A semitone. What's a semitone? A half step or a fret on the guitar. So it's quite literally, I take a perfect fifth, I add a fret, and it turns augmented. Or I take away a fret, and it turns diminished. Okay? The same thing happens with a major interval. If I take a major interval, in this case a major third, right? C, D, E, a major third, and then I take a fret away, it turns into a minor third. Okay? That's a great thing because we can codify that and have specific fingerings for our thirds. Like there's two possible fingerings for major thirds, for instance. Like you can play them on a single string, or you can play them, and those are the two fingerings. So no matter where you go, except between the second and third strings, where you have to modify because of the tuning of the guitar. So then now you're having to play them stacked on top of each other to play your major third. But all that, again, that would be a very long lesson talking about the fingerings of the intervals. If you're interested in that kind of thing and you want me to do a video on that, just let me know in the comments and I'll definitely do it. Otherwise, we'll continue talking because we're just kind of doing an overview of the interval. So we're not done. So that's when that chart. Oh yeah. So let's kind of look at this. So you have major on one side, right? And you have perfect on the other. Okay. If I increase the distance on a perfect interval by one semitone, it turns augmented. Okay. If I decrease the distance by one semitone, it turns diminished. And if I leave it alone, it stays perfect. Major interval, if I increase it, if I make it bigger by one semitone, it turns augmented. If I decrease it, it turns minor. Now, what happens if I take a minor interval? I mean, we know if I increase it, it turns major. But what happens if I decrease it? It turns diminished. Okay? So this is how this is how intervals work. Now, how does that work, and how does that look like in paper or on paper? If I put my notes on the staff, and let's take a major interval, just like I did on the guitar. I'm going to take the fifth, and I'm going to take the third. If I do that with every interval, this video is going to take forever. So you'll understand it just from this. Because the same thing applies to all major intervals and all perfect intervals. And once you know this, you'll understand all the intervals. So we have our fifth here, right? So this is a perfect fifth, C to G, right? If I take my top note and bring it down by a half step, I can use a accidental for that. So I go C to G flat. Now I have a diminished fifth. Okay? Let me do this. So now if I do the same thing, but now I have C to G sharp, now I have an augmented interval. Let me just keep them all the same. All right, so this one is perfect, this one is diminished, this one is augmented. Okay? If I do the same, let's see if I have enough room here to do it all. If I do the same thing with a third, let's say from C to E, right? So I have C and I have E here. Boom. That's a major third. If I take C to E flat, That's a minor third. If I take C to E double flat, that's a diminished third. Okay. And if I take C to E sharp, you have an augmented third. Now, some of those things are going to be kind of ridiculous because you can tell me like, yeah, but an E sharp, is it not the same thing as an F? Yes. That's called an enharmonic equivalent. That they sound the same. But contextually, they're two different things. So one last thing. So how do we do all this? How do we put it all together? But that's where that chart comes in. And this is really just reference memorization. So you have a unison, there's zero distance. A minor second, they're 1 fret away, or 1/2 step. A major second, they're 2 frets away. Minor third, 3 frets away. Major third, 4 frets away. Perfect fourth, 5. An augmented fourth, or diminished fifth, 6. Perfect fifth, 7. Minor sixth, 8. Major sixth, 9. Minor 7, 10. Major 7, 11. Perfect octave, 12. And then you have all the simple intervals. Now, there are more. Later we can talk about what happens when you cross that octave line and, you know, the context in which they work in harmony when you're trying to build chords and things like that. But this is a good overview. There are some less common names for some of these intervals. Like, for instance, a minor third can also be an augmented second and things like that. But or like, minor sixth can be an augmented fifth. But I'm not going to talk about that. I think this video is long enough as it is. Try and understand it. Study this if you really want to learn about intervals and understand it. And yeah, that's what I'm going to say about that for today. And I hope you enjoyed the video. If you have any questions, let me know in the comments. Or come check us out on our website, www.firehousemusic.net. Shoot me an email and I'll reply if you have any questions as well. Yeah, I think that's all I'm going to say about that. And hope you enjoyed the video. If you liked it, don't forget to subscribe on the button down there. See you next time.